The Paddy Power Half Hour on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power, the greatest football partnership since Shearer and Owen.
You're very welcome along to the Paddy Power Half Hour every Friday at 12 o'clock. And I'm Phil Egan, joined by Will O'Callaghan, who's going to be joining us from the Midlands via Skype. How are you doing, Will?
How are things, Phil? Welcome to our Offaly studio this afternoon.
It is. It's an impressive setup you got going on there. Like, you could record albums in your little home studio there, couldn't you?
I think that's the next plan, yeah. I never thought my spare bedroom could be as useful as it's proved to be over the last 6 days or so.
What was your man's name that he had a hit single from recording in his bedroom? Daniel Bedingfield, which actually, funny enough, was called Gotta Get Through This, and that's pretty much what we have to do for the next few months because of the coronavirus. Just to let you know, our football coverage is brought to you by Paddy Power, and for information on responsible gambling, you can visit dunlewy.net. And Will, obviously, every Friday at 12 o'clock we preview the weekend's action, and we're going to start obviously with the weekend's action. Belarus, big game today in Belarus, champions Dinamo Brest, which was news to me, by the way. Bate Borisov had won 13 league titles in a row. No more though. Dinamo Brest won their first league title last season.
So Bate's journey to try and win one in a row begins this weekend, Phil, then?
Well, it started yesterday, and unfortunately for Bate, they lost. They're no longer that team that obviously Dundalk beat, but beat Dundalk as well.
Well, there you go. It's an uphill task for them in the Belarusian league, even just 24 hours into the new season.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're playing catch-up. Well, they could be, presuming that Dinamo Brest go on and win. Earlier on as well, I was watching Australian A-League football. Wes Hoolahan was in action for Newcastle Jets. They lost Brisbane Roar 1-0. A Brisbane Roar team managed by
Robbie Fowler?
Robbie Fowler, yeah.
I saw a bit earlier on as well. Admittedly, I think Australian sport is about all we have going at the moment. Watched a bit of AFL yesterday as well. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting because the Aussie League has probably lots of ex-players from Britain and Ireland who are playing there.
Jay O'Shea played for Brisbane as well today. Yeah,
so it's a bit of interest as we await things to maybe get back kicking in the Northern Hemisphere. We've got an excuse now to watch the Aussie Premier League.
Yeah, and have to mention the goal scorer in the win. Brisbane won 1-0 against Newcastle Jets. 36-year-old Scott McDonald, the former Celtic striker.
Still on the go. So, yeah, I think the first game of the day was 4-2. There was a few more goals in the early kickoff. But
that was it was a cracker between Melbourne City and Central Coast Mariners. I don't know how you're feeling. A bit later on, you've got some action in Burkina Faso. You've got the Palestine West Bank League as well, or a bit of Singapore Premier League as well. So yeah, there is live football going on.
Once upon a time, it was just gamblers who watched the Singapore League, Phil, but we have to take an active interest in it now.
Honestly, I don't even know how you would go about watching it, but to be honest, I probably would watch it. Okay, let's obviously talk about why we're not previewing weekend Premier League action. There was that statement yesterday that it's on hold until the 30th of April. You know, that's a date that was given, but it's hard to imagine that's going to be a date they have to stick to, Will.
Yeah, I'd imagine not. I mean, the one thing that's probably interesting, and I think the sound a lot of people probably heard yesterday, was the relief from Liverpool supporters, just the language that was used by the Premier League in that statement, which was made in conjunction with the EFL and the FA as well, is that they're determined to continue this season and to get it played, because there was no mention within the statement of we are postponing fixtures. They are saying they're extending the seasons indefinitely in order to get them completed, which would give me the impression, Phil, that come what may, they want to finish these fixtures out. For most teams, 9 games left, 10 games left for some. Obviously, there's a lot of creative suggestions about what may happen. The reality is, though, that we have to wait and see how the COVID-19 pandemic plays out over the next few weeks, because Boris Johnson, the British PM, made comments last week that he expected the peak of the disease in Britain to probably be somewhere between 10 and 15 weeks' time, which would bring us into June, which obviously would then open the question about the games being played in the middle of the summer. The only thing that's probably helped the situation as well, as expected on Tuesday, Euro 2020 being postponed back to becoming the 2021 European Championships, has given plenty of wiggle room for the top 5 leagues in Europe to maybe come together and have discussions about how they're going to proceed. I would imagine they're going to have individual calendars that they're going to set up for this to be played, but you've got the big question mark around what happens with continental competition as well. And the La Liga chief, Javier Tebas, had certainly given the impression that the top 5 leagues have been in conversation with the intention of trying to get back playing by mid-May or late May. I think that sounds a little bit optimistic. I'd probably go with Niall Quinn on this, that June is probably a more likely start time, but we don't know. I mean, an awful lot changed in 3 days last week from where we were at a situation where it seemed like containment very quickly became self-isolation across Europe, and the numbers have skyrocketed in many countries. Particularly, we're all very aware of the situation in Italy and in Spain. France have been racking up some huge numbers in terms of cases, and unfortunately quite a few deaths as well. So it's put football onto the back burner, and really we have to wait and see how this phase of fighting the disease works before I think we can make any kind of solid prediction as to when teams are going to be back out on a football field again.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the possibility of playing the rest of the season behind closed doors. Maybe there was a bit of insight into that with the statement that Manchester United released yesterday, where they were talking about paying staff who would be working at Old Trafford, whether there was a crowd there or not. So that's something that could happen. But I think one thing we're seeing from the UK the last few days, whatever about what's going on here, and we haven't gone on full lockdown like they have in other countries. You wonder, is that going to be the next step? But it certainly doesn't look like they're anywhere near that stage in the UK. The schools are only closing today. We closed ours last week.
Yeah, I mean, that's fairly key. Like if we look at, say, Wuhan, where this started in China, they've been in effective lockdown and pretty much a military enforced lockdown since late January. And it's only now that those figures, and we have to take the Chinese government figures on face value when they're providing them, that they say that there's been a halt to the amount of cases. You're looking at over 2 months it has taken to get to that point with very, very strict enforcement. While I know from talking to friends in London last weekend, they said the tube is as busy as it's ever been. It's perhaps even more busy now at night time because there's fewer tubes running. The restaurants in the UK have continued on. As you said, the schools stayed open for over a week longer than they did here, which has created a massive logistics problem, particularly with effectively 2 different systems in operation either side of the land border in this country, with both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as well. So for the best part, I think until recently, maybe the last 2 or 3 days, where the atmosphere has changed a little bit in terms of government policy in the UK, they kind of went with the business as usual approach for the last week. And we have, as a result, seen a big increase in the number of people who've had to self-isolate and who have caught the disease in the UK over the last week or so as well. And, football has been far from immune. We probably know more about football because people are able to be tested a lot more quickly when medical teams have access to squads. And we saw, obviously, Mikel Arteta being diagnosed last Thursday night as being fairly crucial to the Premier League, and then the rest of football across Britain being postponed last Friday, and then Callum Hudson-Odoi on Friday morning. And thankfully, both appear to be making a very good recovery after their diagnosis. But really and truly, I think Britain have been a little bit behind and have had a very different approach to the rest of Europe. So it'll be interesting to see if Boris Johnson's predictions are correct about somewhere between 10 and 15 weeks' time, because if that happens, we certainly won't see teams back out on the pitch in early May. And then the Premier League probably have to look at different solutions. Like I was listening to Gary Neville last night, Phil, and I thought his idea wasn't a bad one, which was basically to try and condense the rest of the Premier League season into a fairly short period of time. He wants the FA Cup to be finished as well. I would think might be controversial to some people who might say, look, just write it off. It's not worth playing another 4 rounds of football to decide a cup champion. But he said effectively you could have a week or 2 of football where, a bit like the Christmas period, teams are playing on a kind of a 2-day to 3-day period between games, televise them all, and have the games running off, an exciting finish to the season with 9 games or so being played in a very short period of time.
Yeah, you'd wonder though, with all those games coming thick and fast, when we think of the Christmas break, players are well into the season. This is going to be a fairly long break out. Now, some clubs have given, I know Tottenham in the last hour or so have announced that they've basically told their players not to train anymore. They're just stay at home, do your own thing. Now, they've obviously, with technology, they can do their own programmes. That's all well and good, but game time, match sharpness, that's going to take a while to come back. So you'd wonder if there is 9 games left and you're trying to squeeze in all these games. Someone like Manchester City, a club like Manchester City, still in the Champions League, still in the FA Cup, obviously have 10 league games left, could have to play another 17 games.
Yeah, and I'm sure Pep Guardiola, Phil, would be the first one who'd say that you need an effective, probably week or 2 of a mini pre-season in order to get players back up to speed beforehand. I think it's not quite as simple as the government say the fixtures are going to resume in a couple of weeks' time and you go back out and put a ball on the pitch and play your next game. And I do wonder as well about the potential dramatic changes to the fixture list as well, because obviously we knew what the fixtures were last weekend. I wonder, do they become the weekend one fixtures when we come back? Or do they continue on with the fixtures as they would have been on the equivalent week if we do get back going in May? Because this could all have a pretty dramatic effect. It could determine where Liverpool pick up the Premier League title. And crucially, the longer this goes on, some players are going to return from injury. I wonder a penny for Jose Mourinho's thoughts about the fact that potentially this break could hand him Harry Kane and Son Heung-min back into his squad.
Yeah, and if you think about Tottenham's next game was due to be against Manchester United. Look at the league table. United are on 45 points, Tottenham 41 points. Up until a couple of weeks ago, I would have said Tottenham have zero chance of finishing in the Champions League places. But like you said, if Harry Kane and Heung-min Son are back, that game takes on even, well, it's going to be an important one anyway, but if they have their best players back for that. At the moment, looking at the Premier League website, because the 30th of April is the date we've been given, Liverpool's next game, according to the Premier League website, is down to be away to Arsenal on the 2nd of May. And obviously the last day of the season is scheduled to be the 17th of May. That's what it was. So that's a decision they're going to have to make. Do they go back to, like you said, what we were due to have before the weekend fixtures were pulled pretty much within hours after the Mikel Arteta news?
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Obviously, big implications probably around the bottom of the table as well, because it can make a huge difference in terms of who you play on that given weekend when you come back, because it's a real scrap for 5 or 6 teams around the bottom. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens, Phil, as well with form off the back of this, because I know we're obviously focusing a lot on Liverpool because Liverpool are within 2 wins of taking the Premier League title, but they have struggled a couple of times off the international breaks this season, and particularly they were shaky coming off with a few defeats, with 3 defeats in 4 games across all competitions on the back of what was the Premier League's inaugural winter break. So you do wonder whether maybe some teams who were in good form going into that before the suspension, you look at teams maybe like Burnley, who may well suffer because they'll have to sit things out now for probably, at the very minimum, you're looking at a 2-month break before they come back. It could really throw things wide open in terms of form when the fixtures do get back going again.
Yeah, and I know like people might think it's strange talking about football and, you know, there's more important things, but I think football is going to play a huge role when things die down a bit and we resume, and people are going to be, unfortunately, people are going to be out of work, people are going to be spending a lot of time at home, and they're going to need something to bring them a bit of joy in life, and football does that for many. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of what we get. Like 9 games, if you get that in a short period of time, some clubs who could be in a position could treat it almost like a pre-season, and then if the new season starts shortly after, then they want to hit the ground running.
Yeah, I wonder will Man City treat it that way, knowing that the Premier League title is gone, that, you know, all their interest was in the cup competitions for the tail end of this season. I wonder how seriously they would treat their remaining 10 Premier League fixtures if they knew that a new season was due to come around pretty quickly afterwards, because that's a big decision that's probably going to have to be made by those who are in the official positions within the Premier League and the EFL and the other leagues at the moment, because we are facing into a season which is now going to run into a European Championships, which was not going to be the case before. And then you've got the condensed start to the season of 2022, because we're getting ready for the World Cup in Qatar as well. You know, it seemed very simple during the week, and it was a very neat solution that Euro 2020 would be pushed back by 12 months and become Euro 2021. But that summer was being used as a buffer, particularly to get players back a bit quicker for the change of calendar for the season in 2022. So that puts that up in the air, and you'd have to wonder whether there'll be implications for next season as well. Will something radical have to happen? I know a lot of people have already discussed the idea of the English League Cup being dropped for next year, just to maybe create that bit of extra space and maybe extra rest for players, because ultimately you are going to be asking them to turn around probably pretty quickly after this Premier League season finishes and come back out for another campaign. Yeah,
we haven't even mentioned the Africa Cup of Nations. That's meant to be taking place January 2021. So where does that fit into? Certain clubs have several African players in their squad, so they're going to be missing them. But there's going to have to be a serious thing about what they do for next season. But I think we've all pretty much accepted that they are going to finish this season. The calls from the likes of Karen Brady saying void the season, it looks like that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think, look, they probably, those who were looking to avoid it, and apparently 2 or 3 Premier League teams, Miguel Delaney was telling us last week, were looking for a void and start again next year. Karen Brady was the epitome of self-interest when she spoke in The Sun last Sunday, because West Ham are hovering just above the relegation zone at the moment. They'd be more than happy to say, thanks a lot, thanks for the fish, and we'll be back next season. But realistically, I think aside from maybe themselves and Spurs who probably out of self-interest would like the season voided because they could go back into Europe for next year if it was based on the European places from the year before. I think everyone else wants to get it finished, and it's any Liverpool supporter, I would have massive sympathy with them at the moment, because 30 years of a wait, you're that close to winning the Premier League. Maybe if they hadn't dropped points against Manchester United and Watford, they could have had this sewn up even by now. But they've been so remarkable this season. They're very worthy Premier League champions as well. If the season was to be voided, and I genuinely don't think that's going to happen based on the comments that were made in the statement yesterday, it would be an absolute injustice if Jurgen Klopp's side don't get to lift the trophy at the end of this campaign.
But even if they had won it, Will, if they had mathematically won it, the season could still be voided and you could take the title off them, because you still would have had to sew up relegation spots, Champions League spots. We don't know what's going to happen with Manchester City's appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Apparently already a few cases have been put on hold because places are in lockdown, so the Court of Arbitration for Sport there's going to be a bit of a backlog. So the intention from City was to get this heard nice and quickly, and they'd know where they stand, whether they'd get a year taken off the 2-year ban or be cleared that they could play in next season's Champions League. So that's another little thing, because we've talked about teams trying to finish in the top 4. We know at the moment, if you finish 5th, you're going to get Champions League football because of the ban Manchester City gets. So it's all obviously up in the air. What's it going to do in terms of, at the start of the season, we would have always picked our players of the year, our candidates or whatever. I think there's only a few in that conversation. That's not really going to change, is it?
I don't think so, no. Like, unless someone was to have a quite remarkable few weeks when the season was to come back, I think you're looking at probably Virgil van Dijk and Sadio Mane will probably be my 2 favourites to win. I think Jordan Henderson has a chance for the way that he's played all this year as well. He's probably going to be very popularly voted by his fellow pros as well. And I think particularly the English players in the Premier League are likely to give Henderson a vote. I mean, outside of that, you're probably looking maybe Kevin De Bruyne for Man City. But I think all of the outstanding candidates come from the team in red, who are Liverpool. I can't really see anyone. I think this is a straight battle between Mane and Van Dijk, personally.
Yeah, I think I always look to see who the writers give it to, because they're the ones that are at games week in, week out. The PFA, the players are voting for players that they mightn't see play that much. They might just judge them on how they played against them in the home and away games. They might just go with how some of their teammates are doing it. From what we believe, some of them are filling out forms, sitting beside each other in a dressing room. It'd be like me asking you, it's like, who have you got down there? The copycat method. But it seems fairly irrelevant at the moment in terms of what we can do. Looking back I've kind of been looking at some classic games over the last few days. Obviously, Sky are great at putting up the Premier League classic years, and I was watching the 95 season, the one that Blackburn won, and just the drama of that. Even thinking to this season, Will, is there any game you'd think, I want to watch that game again?
Yeah, there's been a few good games. I mean, we have had a bit of a misfire when it comes to a lot of the big fixtures between the top clubs at the moment. But there's been a few kind of properly dramatic ones. I'd like to go back and re-watch the backs against forward scenario that was Aston Villa against Liverpool just before Christmas, when it looked like Villa were going to win that game up until I think 84 minutes gone, and then Liverpool just kept on bashing away and then managed to get themselves a couple of goals. Aside from that, I think a lot of the big games, maybe my memory is failing me here, is that we've had a lot of clashes that have kind of not necessarily lived up to the hype. The Manchester United and Liverpool games particularly have been extremely tense this season. The Man City against Manchester United games have been strange in that United have won them, perhaps a little bit against the run of play in the case of the game at the Etihad Stadium, but they were quite impressive in the game that they won at Old Trafford. And again, I thought Liverpool were impressive in their games against Man City, but those games were probably less about the entertainment factor and more about the fact that we knew it was a 2-horse race when the fixtures came around. Any that particularly stand out for you, Phil?
I nearly want to watch back what Man City did to Watford and how they managed to score 8 goals in a game. The Villa Liverpool game you mentioned was quite a significant day, because obviously there was a stage during that afternoon. It was a Saturday afternoon, so it's rare that you would get City and Liverpool playing at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. So you found Liverpool a goal down to Villa. At one stage, City were 1 down to Southampton at the Etihad. They got it back to 1-1. Then Kyle Walker scores late for City, and City are going to Anfield the following week, and all of a sudden the gap could be a bit narrower. But then Liverpool pull it out of the bag, beat City the next week, and from then on it's pretty much been a procession for Liverpool. There's been a few games where they've had to dig out results, but they've done it pretty much all season until the last few games. I think the way United have performed in the big games, that first half an hour they put in at the Etihad was everything that's good about Manchester United, and then you could watch them the next week and they can't break anyone down. That's obviously why they brought in Bruno Fernandes, who's just been named the player of the month. But there's other, some of the other games off the top of my head. I think the Tottenham-Liverpool game, where Tottenham obviously scored early, Liverpool battered them and eventually got the breakthrough. And Jordan Henderson is a player you mentioned. He actually gave the ball away for the Harry Kane goal, but then comes up with the equaliser in the second half, and then Serge Aurier did what Serge Aurier does, and he gave away a penalty.
It could be a season that's remembered for A, particularly brilliant champions, B, the introduction of VAR, and C, the crazy finish of the season, probably more so than what we've seen in terms of brilliant games on the field. We obviously have still 9 game weeks to play between now and the end of the season, whenever it does return as well. But I think probably what people are going to remember from this year, rather than maybe one classic game or 2 classic games, they're probably going to just remember how good Liverpool were up until the point when this season was actually called to a stop.
Yeah, and it's actually nice not to be talking about VAR for once.
It's a nice break, isn't it? Yeah, it's. I think the funny part is we're going to be so hungry and keen for football to return. I think we're going to be happy enough with VAR, and I'm going to give out to anybody who bemoans a 0-0 draw once football gets back going as well. Because at this stage, you mentioned obviously you've got Premier League years. If you want to watch a bit of football at the moment, FIFA have opened up their archive on YouTube over the last 24 hours as well, and have put up a lot of their World Cup footage. Some of that is new that I hadn't actually seen before as well. And anyone who has Amazon Prime, it's worth checking out the FIFA official videos of each of the World Cups are up there as well. Obviously, you can watch the nostalgic footage of the really old football, or if you want to watch it maybe, particularly from 2006 up, where the cameras have improved that a little bit, and I think the access has improved quite a bit in terms of what they were allowed film as part of the series as well. There's some really, really good footage of those World Cups, and I watched 2006 last night, and it's really good. It actually brought back an awful lot of nostalgia about watching that tournament, which was a little bit better even than I remember.
Yeah, I think it's the best one I can remember. I spent that summer in America, so I would have been getting up early to watch these games. So come 4 or 5 in the afternoon, I've watched 3 games of football, and that Italy-Germany semi-final is unbelievable.
Oh. Yeah, and an unbelievable goal to win it as well. It's outrageous. The final was so dramatic as well, even though it wasn't a particularly brilliant final between France and Italy. What happened with Zidane, the fact he had penalties at the end of it as well. Really, really good tournament. You can probably see the start of maybe Spain starting to come to the fore during it as well. A lot of good games to watch back during it too. And I would strongly recommend, if you want to get some football, if you're feeling the withdrawal symptoms like Phil and I are at the moment, that's a really good option if you get bored of Premier League years and seeing the 96 season for the 4th time that week. Yeah,
and you can watch back on how Ireland did when they used to qualify for World Cups. We should actually speak about Ireland now. And obviously, Euro 2020 postponed. That creates a bit of a dilemma for the FAI because of the Mick McCarthy, Stephen Kenny issue. If the playoff against Slovakia, which is penciled in for June, again, these all have massive asterisks beside them. If the game did go ahead and Ireland were not to qualify, that takes it all out of the FAI's hands. But it would seem, you mentioned an injustice for Liverpool if they didn't get to lift the Premier League title. If Mick McCarthy qualified Ireland for the Euros, which obviously take place next year, it would seem very unfair that he doesn't get to lead the team to the Euros.
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion would be, Phil, that at this stage, Mick McCarthy has to be in charge for as long as these European Championships journey continue. So if Ireland were to win a couple of qualifiers in June, if they were to win in Bratislava and then go on to beat Bosnia-Herzegovina or Northern Ireland in the final round of the playoffs, you have to keep Mick McCarthy in charge. It's unfortunate for Stephen Kenny, because obviously Stephen Kenny had his contract from August of this year, and he would have been due to take over for the games in the Nations League in September. In all likelihood, those Nations League games are unlikely to happen because they're going to be moved to allow domestic seasons to be finished, or for players to get some rest after an extended season. So I think the matter of Stephen Kenny taking over is less relevant, particularly if Mick McCarthy was to get Ireland to the European Championships. I just hope, from Mick McCarthy's point of view, he didn't have a club job lined up for next year, because he's been fairly honest. I think most recently at the draw a few weeks ago, when he said, look, I want to get back into club management for next year, he was basing all that on the fact that the finals were coming around. It's a bit like Ronald Koeman at the moment as well, who has announced this week that pretty much he had the Barcelona job lined up for this summer. They had only given Quique Setién a 6-month contract at Barcelona, and Koeman was due to take over. He has a clause in his contract with the Netherlands, which was inserted back in January, when he had to turn the Barcelona job down because he was staying in charge of the Dutch for Euro 2020. He's now had to put that clause back to next year. So he, in all likelihood, has missed out on the club job as a result. So I hope Mick McCarthy didn't have something lined up. And hopefully, from our perspective, Ireland can navigate these two, albeit still very difficult, playoffs, to have to go away from home to Slovakia and then away from home to either Bosnia or to Northern Ireland to qualify for the finals. It's still going to be a very stiff task, I think, for Ireland to get there. But if Mick McCarthy was to navigate those two hurdles, I think he simply has to be in charge for next year.
Yeah, and speaking of Stephen Kenny, and obviously, his stock rose with his job that he did at Dundalk, and the domestic league. We've been just talking about the Premier League, but the domestic league, we saw the reality of what's ahead yesterday with the news of Sligo laying off all their staff, now be it temporarily, and they've come out since and say that they're not going to go under. But this is just something they had to do. But Sligo are the first Premier Division club, but you imagine, Will, not the last.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the margins are not there for League of Ireland clubs by comparison to other leagues. The Premier League conceivably could finish out without fans in the stadiums, because their TV deal is so lucrative that it would actually compensate quite a bit for not having paying members coming through the gates. Unfortunately, for the League of Ireland clubs, their day-to-day is based upon gate receipts, and that's why it's such a problem for them when they don't have a run of home games. If for any reason games are postponed and say they've only got one home game in a month, even at that point, cash flow becomes a major issue for clubs. I think what's happened with Sligo is Sligo being realistic. We saw Hearts in the Scottish Premiership have effectively said, look, we're going to have to ask you to take 50% pay cuts, and that's going to go from their top players right down to the tea lady and the guy who marks the pitch.
The manager, he's waived his wages now. He's said, I'm not going to claim them now. Daniel Stendhal.
That is, I mean, realistically, we're not talking about League of Ireland players receiving large sums of money when you talk about maybe some of the pay cuts that might have to happen in other leagues at the moment. But, realistically, League of Ireland clubs would have and could never have budgeted for what has happened. Like in a 2 to 3 day period, their season has been put entirely on hold. And then you add to that as well that the vast majority of these clubs are relying on local sponsors, people selling lotto tickets probably in the pub at the weekend to try and just keep the day-to-day going in terms of income for the club. In all likelihood, Mary, who runs the shop, and John, who runs the pub, might well have to close down over the next while we're in social isolation, or certainly their footfall is going to be heavily affected. They're going to struggle to still be able to give sponsorship money to their local League of Ireland club. And I know some people have had a really good idea, which is just buy merchandise from the clubs. And some clubs have, released extra merchandise or even special kits over this period in the hope that some of their supporters might just buy something in order to keep a certain amount of cash coming in. The good news for some clubs, particularly the bigger ones, is that their season ticket money will already have been banked from the start of the year, which will help. But I think a lot of clubs, and especially those outside the top flight, or maybe those struggling towards the bottom of the Premier Division, are so reliant on everybody coming through their gate on a Friday night or a Saturday evening in order to pay their few quid to come in and watch football. And this has to be, I would say, a very scary time for clubs up and down the country, because already they weren't particularly cash rich, and this is going to put huge pressure on it. It's unfortunate for players as well, Phil. Obviously we're looking at a league which is for the best part-time across the two top flights, but there are some clubs that are semi-pro and some that are giving professional a go as well. It's a big impact for players if you're potentially not picking up a check, and they're going to have to be, I think, protected by the FAI in the coming couple of months as well, because some of them are juggling jobs on top of this as well. Some aren't, because they were lucky enough maybe to get one of the top clubs, but it has to be a very worrying time for them. Like a lot of people in this country at the moment, I think we're facing into dire economic straits, but League of Ireland football, I can't do anything more than encourage everybody when it does get back going, if it gets going in June again, to go down and watch your local club. I know you're a Cabinteely local now at this stage, Phil. Maybe on a Friday night, if you guys can get a chance to go along and watch a game, it could make all the difference to clubs who are going to be coming out the back of a very difficult couple of months. Yeah,
and I know that the 19 League of Ireland clubs are going to meet with the FAI today. They're going to meet with the interim CEO, Gary Owens, and I think the general feeling, Will, is early June. If that's a possibility, it would give them the chance to finish the season before the end of 2020, which then obviously has no impact on next season because it wouldn't obviously start till maybe early February. But if it goes beyond June, you start to wonder, will they have to reduce games? The way things are at the moment, there's 31 rounds of matches left in the Premier Division, and they're obviously going to have to play midweek a lot more than they do. I hope they don't go down the route of Friday to Monday, because I think that's a stretch in a lot of squads. You know, is there maybe an option to go Saturday, Tuesday, maybe Saturday afternoons? This is just us thinking out loud. It's all up in the air. We don't know. You can't sit here today and say this is how things are going to play out, because we genuinely haven't got a clue.
Yeah, no, it's absolute speculation. But one of the kites that have been flown, Phil, in terms of the League of Ireland is that if it doesn't return by June, because we're only a few weeks into the new campaign, they might consider playing winter football for next year, moving away from the Summer League, maybe kicking things back off in August or September and allowing that bit of space to breathe by maybe running the season around to April or May of the following year. I think that's going to be pretty hotly discussed, but I think that has to be something that's on the table, because I just think, again, to use Niall Quinn's phrase, it's optimistic to think that the League of Ireland will be back in place by June. I mean, Leo Varadkar's comments on St. Patrick's Day as well strongly suggested that we're in the calm before the storm. There's the potential for this pandemic at this point to get even worse over the coming weeks. And if that happens, again, like we're saying about the Premier League, it's very unlikely that a switch is just going to be flicked and you say, right, we're back onto the field next week.
OK, Will O'Callaghan, we'll leave it there. We're going to chat to you again next Friday at midday. Maybe we'll be talking more Belarusian football, see how Dinamo Brest get on. There's they're kicking off their campaign this afternoon, but yeah, very little live football. That's Will O'Callaghan. I said that's our lot for this afternoon. We'll be back at 12 o'clock next Friday, and maybe we might look back on a few games, and we might have more news on when the seasons might come back. Until then, thanks very much. Take care.
The Paddy Power Half Hour on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power, the greatest football partnership since Jeff and Heskey.